好，台湾难道现在出现外星人的踪影吗？国内飞碟协会公布了一张，这民众呢在台东嘉明湖拍到的照片，原本应该是高山的景色，竟然看到呢突然出现一个身形有点类似人物的不明物体，而且它的头部呢长得像昆虫，手部还有蹼。在经过再三的鉴定，发现这张照片是没有经过修改或是造假的，也让协会现在是高度的怀疑，很有可能这就是外星人。
高山美景的山坡上，乍看之下没什么，但把画面拉近仔细瞧，就在山丘的左侧，似乎有个形状和人相似的透明不明物体。近一点看，更发现头部呈圆锥状，形似螳螂，双手有蹼的形状，推判身高大约250公分，而且眼神似乎往摄影者的方向看。这是一名陈先生去年5月25号在台东嘉明湖拍摄到的照片，回家后才惊觉自己竟然拍到了这张疑似外星人的照片，让飞碟学会极度怀疑这就是外星人。
他大概是站在这个位置，站在这个位置，拍照者大概是站在这里拍的。
传回现场以及找专家分析照片，都没有发现照片造假或动过手脚，但摄影专家还是找出不合理的地方。
合成技巧有很多种，所以我们无法得知它是由什么样子去做合成的。然后它有可能是在拍摄后它有去动到，都有可能。我目击者应该不可能只有一个人，对，因为如果照这比例的话，它可能它的这外星的比例，它可能跟山一样大。
现在学会打算与国外研究团体进行分析。70多年来，民众对于外星生物是否存在一直都有问号。而这次在台东嘉明湖拍到了疑似外星人的照片，更让当地增添了几分外星人的神秘色彩。但是真是假，只能说信者恒信。这边是许玉萍台北报道。
Yeah, that's the number to call in live if you want to comment on the video that we just posted on Third Phase, or if you want to break news yourself with the UFO sighting you captured, you can call into 347-934-0378. You know, what I also found fascinating...
Well, first of all, I appreciate the intended encouragement, but I really came at this whole subject because of my love for the Bible. It happens that I come out of an information science background. My whole career, 30 years in the strategic community, gives me perhaps a little different perspective than most people would have going at this topic, but I want to right up front indicate it was my biblical interest that brought me into this rather than my high-tech background, although that's proven to be, that and my Department of Defense connections have been very valuable to me. So that's one of the reasons I find myself in this peculiar posture.
So you found a controversial verse in Genesis 6, which has to do with a prophecy that Jesus said.
I start with Jesus, and in Matthew 24, he gives 4 disciples an inside briefing on a second coming. And in that briefing, he makes a very strange remark. He says, as the days of Noah were, so shall the days of the coming of the Son of Man be. Now, many people presume he just meant that it was because of the business of usual. So anyway, the point is, we need to understand what the days of Noah were like in order to understand what he was saying. So that takes us to Genesis 6, and when you jump into Genesis 6, you quickly discover that very few seminaries teach what that passage really says. And so as you get into that Genesis 6, you have to understand the first 2 verses are one sentence, and it deals with the strange goings-on between the fallen angels producing hybrids with humans. And that was so uncomfortable in the early years of the church that it was the understanding of the early rabbis. It was also the understanding of the early church that what it was dealing with was fallen angels cohabiting with human women, producing a strange hybrid offspring. But when you get to about the 5th century, that was a very uncomfortable posture. So they cooked up this, what they call the lines of Seth argument, and that's what's taught in most seminaries. One of the things I discover is that many people who are seminary products of most seminaries haven't been taught that there are different perspectives of Genesis 6, and it's the literal, careful study version of Genesis 6 that starts to raise the fog on this whole issue.
Now tell me about the word Nephilim. What does that mean?
In the Hebrew, it comes from the verb nephal. It means the fallen ones, and that's the term used. Don't confuse that with the fallen angels. The fallen angels, according to Genesis 6, cohabited with human women to produce a hybrid offspring that are called in the Hebrew the Nephilim. In the Septuagint version of the Old Testament, the translation of the Old Testament into Greek, they use the word gigantes, which is transliterated giants, right. And they did happen to be giants, but that's not what the word means. The word actually means, in the Greek, the earthborn. And so, from the Greek point of view, they're earthborn. From the Hebrew point of view, they're the fallen ones. But either way, they're pointing to a hybrid, and it apparently was part of Satan's plan to contaminate the Messianic line.
But so the purpose of the flood was to get rid of these.
Exactly. That's exactly the point. When you study verse 9 of Genesis 6, it speaks of Noah, that his genealogy was untainted, unblemished. And apparently it was a distinctive in that sense. He may not have been the only one unblemished, but the fact that he was unblemished qualified him for what God was going to do, among other things. But the point is, the whole issue that God chose to do was to save 8 people in the ark and erase the blackboard, so to speak.
Okay, but if the blackboard was erased, then we don't have to fool with them today, if they were all destroyed.
Except Genesis 6 verse 4 says there were Nephilim in the land in those days, comma, and also after that. And we discover, many good Bible scholars miss this, that you really won't understand subsequent events in the Old Testament by not realizing it happened again. When God, in Genesis 15 and Genesis 17, confirms the land covenant to Abraham, he tells Abraham that he and his descendants are going to be away for 400 years, but after 400 years, they're going to return. That gave Satan, who's obviously listening, the realization that he had 4 centuries to lay down a minefield. And that's why, when Moses enters the land, and he sends his at Kadesh Barnea, he sends in the 12 reconnoiters, if I can call them that. They come back and say, and Numbers 13, verse 33 says they were Nephilim in the land. So it happened again.
So many astronauts are reporting UFOs, but one was amazing. This one astronaut, John Blaha, a ham radio operator, actually picked up what he was saying. As a matter of fact, a picture's worth 1,000 words.
Perhaps we need some outside universal threat. I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world. And yet, I ask you, is not an alien force already among us? What could be more alien to the universal aspirations of our peoples than war and the threat of war?
How people might react to news of a real extraterrestrial communication. Alexander had been a
My experience has have made me believe that we are in a military kind of thing going on with, in fact, other life forms, which are higher life forms, which are unseen, as you talked about, and I've talked about too, the reptile alien presence. What are we talking about, reptile alien presence? I don't know exactly what all of this means, but I know it's there. I've heard way too much not to know that there is a reptile alien presence on the Earth.
Right. Yeah. The alien presence on this planet, Stuart, if it exists, probably started a long time ago. We're going to spend some time this hour talking with you about it. What do you think?
Well, that's a very large topic, and in order to explain it, I need to give a little bit of a history lesson.
Okay.
And if we go back to eons of time ago, we find out that the solar system as it exists today is not the way it used to be. In fact, Earth used to be the second planet in orbit from the sun, and it was basically covered in water. Even the atmosphere was very liquidy. Mars was the third planet, and then there was a larger planet which is called Maldek, which existed between what is now Mars and Jupiter. And then after Jupiter was Saturn, then Uranus, Neptune, and that was it. Pluto did not exist. And then I need to go to another part of the galaxy, to a place called the Lyrian star system.
Okay. How far? How many light years?
Oh, gosh, I have no idea, but it's towards the center of the galaxy.
Okay.
The Lyrian star system, for all intents and purposes, is where humanity began. That is the home area of all of humanity. There was also a star system called the Draco star system, and that was basically a reptilian empire. And the reptilians have a mindset where they feel an obligation to seek out and destroy or assimilate all other creatures or species, because they feel the reptilian life form is the most perfect representation of God or God mind. And the reason that they feel that way is because reptilians in the Draco star system are androgynous, meaning male and female in the same body. And so they feel that most closely represents the neutral God mind or God energy. Also, reptilian DNA does not change over eons of time. It basically stays the same and does not alter, whereas mammalian DNA constantly changes and adapts as environments change. And so they feel that because reptilians are so stable in genetics, it proves that they're superior. And again, I'm not qualifying this by saying this is right or wrong. I'm just saying that that's how they think. And so they attacked the Lyrian star system and basically dispersed any of the survivors that were in there. And the survivors of the Lyrian star system fanned out across the known galaxy and colonized other solar systems, this one included. When they came here, the planet Mars and the planet Maldek had atmosphere, oceans. It was a very inhabitable environment, and they started colonies there. The reptilian Dracos followed them across the various colonies and attacked them. The Draco use hollowed-out asteroids or comets as weapons and vehicles that they then send into space. And what they did was send an ice comet into our solar system to attack and destroy the colonies. As that ice comet came into the system, it caused the planet Uranus to flip on its axis. Uranus is the only planet known that orbits in a north to south direction instead of an east to west as all other planets do, and that's because it was knocked off of its original axis. It then continued towards in the solar system and approached the planet Maldek, and the pressure or the gravitational pull of the ice comet, planet Maldek, and the large gas planet Jupiter caused the Maldek to explode, which is why we have the asteroid belt now between Mars and Jupiter.
Okay.
And a lot of the fragments of Maldek became the many moons of Jupiter and Saturn as they get caught up in the gravitational fields. And in fact, the rings of Saturn recently have been exposed as being pieces of ice and rock, which could have come from Maldek and the ice comet.
On this Earth right now, dark forces that are from somewhere else, and there are good forces here from somewhere else, and that they are playing out some kind of a war, as we've been discussing, some kind of a control factor is being at war with some kind of a good force that's trying to save mankind during this transition.
And you're from somewhere else as well. You gave us 2 hours of video to testimony.
Well, I mean, I just said that. Yeah, I just said that.
And I think we're all probably from somewhere else. Most of the people watching this video are...
And it went into this rotation with the Earth so that the oceans on Earth started to polarize, and the spinning of the Earth started to form the ice caps, and eventually the Earth and this ice comet switched places so that the ice comet became the second object in the orbit of the sun, and the Earth was pushed out to third position. The ice comet became the planet Venus as we know it now.
All right, and this was very similar to what Velikovsky believes, right?
Well, that's true. His theory was very, very, very correct for the most part. Now, because the planet Venus or the ice comet was so close to the sun, it caused the ice to melt, but rapidly to the point where it became steam and vapor, which is why Venus is covering clouds.
Okay.
And now the Earth being pushed out into the third position now became very inhabitable. Land masses appeared, and the Draco drove another vehicle into orbit of this planet to colonize it, and we now call that object the Moon. The Moon, as you know, does not spin in space as other natural objects.
Are you saying the Moon is artificial, or it's natural, but it was pushed there?
It was a hollowed-out object, a natural object that was driven into orbit around the Earth.
All right.
So it was a vehicle that was of a natural origin.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, and then that's why only one side of the Moon faces the Earth at all times. It doesn't spin. It's like a vehicle parked in space, which is basically what it is. And if you send a sonic resonance off the surface of the Moon, it pings like a hollow object. It does not thump like a solid object.
I've heard that. That's true.
Yes, and even now, we're starting to get a little bit of information. They're saying, well, there's a little bit of an atmosphere on the Moon. There's a little bit of water on the Moon. And Mars used to have oceans, and they're starting to just reveal some information that I've been talking about for years, which is basically verifying everything that I've been telling people all these decades.
That's a remarkable story, and, there have been glimpses of this. Are you familiar at all, Stuart, with the work of Zecharia Sitchin?
Yes, of course.
Now, where does his work come in terms of that planet that comes here, Nibiru? You didn't mention that.
Yes, you see, here's the other thing. That Nibiru, which is also in some cultures called Marduk, this is also an artificial object which has an elliptical orbit in space. It is controlled by another type of reptilian being. It is not the Draco, but it's actually a different species.
The Anunnaki, he said, right?
Yes, and what we learned at Montauk was that group was actually enemies of the Draco, and that they were antagonistic towards each other. Now, interestingly enough, back in 1999, I believe it was in LA Times and possibly also in the New York Times, there was an article stating that a large object NASA had detected past the orbit of Pluto in an elliptical orbit around our sun, and that we can expect to see that object come closer to the Earth around the year 2003. That was back in 1999. And as usual, when the New World Order government sends out information that they want people to know, they send it out in a little blip like that, and then you never see it again. And that's kind of their legal out, that they told you everything and that it wasn't a surprise.